Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 198th New Social Environment. I'm Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Kate Fowle and Joachim Pissarro. We're also thrilled to have the poet Coco Fitterman here, who will read to close today's program. To begin, I ask you all to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. I also want to highlight that the state of New York is currently engaged in a baseless lawsuit against the Shinnecock Nation, so I will drop a link in the chat soon if you want to learn more about that and contribute to their cause. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., Casey Godson, and countless others who we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country, and acknowledge that justice will come from the streets and from the nation demanding accountability, refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Before I introduce our host and guest today, please join me for a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce our host and guest today. Joachim Pissarro is the Burchard Professor of Art History and Director of the Hunter College Galleries, Hunter College, CUNY City University of New York. He was a curator at MoMA's Department of Painting and Sculpture, and he is also a consulting editor here at the Brooklyn Rail. Kate Fowle is the director of MoMA PS1. She was appointed in 2019 after 6 years as the inaugural chief curator of the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow, Russia. I will post some extended bios in the chat if you would like to have a read. But I also want to share a special thank you to Helen Lee, a board member here at the Rail. That was a part of the planning of this conversation and unfortunately couldn't make it today. But we send our best to Helen and thank her for being a part of this conversation series with museum directors. So without further ado, I hand the mic over to you, Joachim.
Thank you, Nick. And Kate, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here today to this great program that was started by Fong and his incredible team, just as pretty much the COVID crisis began. And it's been really one of the most vibrant, one of the richest programs. I know we've centered our interviews on museum directors. We've had the luck and the privilege of having, in fact, your colleague Glenn Lowry and Thelma Golden. I know that you're going to talk with us about some of your programs jointly with the Studio Museum. It's a great pleasure to have you. I wish my co-hostess Helen Lee could be with us today. She is with us in spirit, and I know she's listening to this program. You have an extraordinary, let's start with this, career already. You're incredibly young, and yet when one reads your CV, it's like already 2 or 3 professional lives there that could fit in. So without further ado, would you like perhaps to take us briefly through your trajectory? You started at the ICI, maybe you started before the ICI, then went to Russia to become the chief curator of the Garage, not a small move. And now you're back in this country, being the director, the 3rd director of PS1. Do you want to briefly tell us a little bit about this very unusual trajectory for a museum curator, director?
Yes, it's really nice to see all of you. Thanks for coming. And I can't believe it's 198, did you say? So Fong and
Indeed.
well done. That's incredible. That's sustainability. So as you can tell by my accent, I actually grew up in England, and I used to run an organization called Smith and Fowle in the 1990s, which was a partnership run out of an office in the East End of London that was working with different organizations across the country to basically find different ways of sustaining artist practices that were working outside of the commercial gallery system. So a lot of commissioning work. I then fell in love and moved to San Francisco. So that's how I ended up there and started running a master's program in curatorial practice at California College of the Arts. And that at the time was the third master's program in curating in the country. So that was at the beginning of the 2000s. And then from there, I moved to China because I was focusing a lot on what was happening in Asia in the early 2000s. And I worked at the Ulan Center for Contemporary Art as the first international curator there. Then I ran ICI, Independent Curators International, in New York. And then I went to Russia to Garage Museum of Contemporary Art. And then last September, I started as director of PS1. And 6 months later, we went into COVID. So I've had half my time on the job in the building and the other half fantasizing about PS1 from a distance. So
yeah,
in a nutshell.
Quite an extraordinary series of moves. And so there are not many people who can claim to have been curators, who have led a curatorial practice. And I was thinking of 3 continents, but in fact, it's more or less, in China. I forgot that very important episode in your life. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I mean, 4 continents and major positions in some really truly critical institutions. How has that been, and how do you feel about this today? And how does that perhaps inflect your own vision, your own practice as a museum director back in this country?
I mean, I think it's a product of the generation that I come out of, because I came of age professionally and personally in the 1990s. So, because by that time I was in my early 20s, and that is the moment of kind of globalization in the art world crashing into each other. And so I went to art school. I then got interested in working with artists. I wasn't actually interested in working in museums in particular at all, because I didn't feel a kind of sense of that I could belong, the way that I was thinking about art, I could belong in a museum type structure. But I could see that there were these biennials happening all over the world, and I kind of grew up learning, like alongside other people who wanted to curate and work with artists, about an art world that was beyond the West, really from the beginning of my career. And so it was probably a lot more straightforward in terms of thinking, that you could work in these different places than before. Yeah. And I knew that I just wasn't interested. I wanted to learn what was, in working in Beijing, it's like I wanted to understand from the perspective of living and working in China, what the issues are around building new institutions in places that haven't up to that point been kind of recognized centers for art. So learning firsthand, learning from people that live, eat, sleep and breathe in those contexts.
And so you're right. Sorry, that's fascinating. Yes, and this is of course the biennial, the decade of the biennialization. One might say of the art world. I remember at MoMA one day, Klaus Wiesenbach came to a trustees meeting and he said, there are now 300 something biennials per year. So you could theoretically spend your entire calendar, the year calendar, going from one biennial to another. You wouldn't have exhausted all of them. It was a shocking kind of statistic. I'm sure today it's probably double that amount. But so what year did you arrive?
Jump in there though, because what's interesting about the whole kind of biennial structure that literally was spawned in the 1990s, we all recognize that Venice and other biennials start 100 years before that, basically. But again, I was part of a generation that was looking at the fact that there were problems with the way that these biennials were suddenly turning up in other places, and there needed to be investment in artists and systems and structures that would be long-term in various places, rather than this kind of drop-in, drop-out mentality that gets kind of generated with the international art world traveling from biennial to biennial. It's like, so it was very important to me and to a number of other people at the time that, there was something that was growing that was for artists in those places, rather than this kind of caravan of exhibition making.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Ulan Center, so you worked there. So that was in the 1990s. That was the beginning of the opening up of the Chinese contemporary art scene, right? The District 798, is that the name of the place? Were you in the first generation of curators who were working there?
I moved to China in 2006.
2006.
So, and the Ulan Center opened in 2007.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's like, I mean, it comes out in the 1990s, there were exhibitions happening internationally. And there was the first generation of, I mean, the first generation of, that we focused on at the Ulans is the 85 New Wave movement, which was kind of earlier than the 1990s and then started working forward from there. But yeah, so it was in the late 2000s that I was living there. Around the time that it happened.
What, around the time of what, sorry?
When the Olympics happened.
Oh, yeah.
And
right. Of course, absolutely.
The big floods and the earthquake.
Well, and what was that like? I mean, in effect, you have had in your career the sort of founding role, because you arrive in Moscow as well 6 years later to begin, well, not exactly to begin the garage, because it had a sort of previous life before you, but really the second life, the new life of the garage back in 2012. Am I correct?
Yeah,
so twice,
beginning of 13.
Twice in your career, you've had this major role in sort of initiating, launching a new institution on a different continent, a different language, different culture. Can you take us through this pretty big challenge each time?
Yeah, I mean, it's the navigation is understanding the kind of inherent coloniality of a British person going to different places and you know, having the privilege and the opportunity of defining how a museum might develop. And that is something, you know, I'm kind of hyper aware of. And I think one of the reasons why I've worked in a number of different places is that when I start living and working somewhere, I go out of my way to reverse that system, because I am of a younger generation that thinks quite differently to what new institutions could look like and where they get built and how, not where as in location, but how they get built in terms of from the ground up within the context of certain communities. And so what's interesting about the type of work that I've got very interested in is that it comes out of almost kind of understanding the thinking that artists have and the practice that curators have as the kind of turning point to how you could start to build institutions that really connect into communities, and kind of shifting, like trying to remove the bureaucracy and the hierarchy within these structures. And quite simply, the reason why I was in China and in Russia is because this is where it's possible to start to think about new institutionality. Because you have like ways in which people are prepared to take risks, ways in which people are, you know, there's a new generation of individuals that are getting involved in these institutions, and there's no longer the kind of burdens of the 19th century and 20th century traditions of museums.
Right. Absolutely. No, I love what you're telling us right now, because in a sense, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but there seems to be a common thread from your the first job you described back in London, where you also take care of this alternative space and you work with artists trying to establish a system of sustainability for these artists. And it seems that this has been a kind of continuous interest and concern of yours throughout your different positions. Am I right?
Yeah.
And so shall we move to, I mean, everybody knows, I mean, those of our listeners who know you know that you've had this just stupendous position at the garage with Dasha Zukova and Ivan, and you really took this institution and completely transformed it and brought it up to the forefront. I know that you have some extraordinary images. I would love to talk about some of those with you. But so how did that happen? I mean, because this is, again, even though by the time you came out of China, you already had this very diverse and rich background already, incredibly young as you were, it's still not an obvious step to go from Beijing to Moscow. So how did that happen? And can you take us through this again?
Yeah, I mean, when I left Beijing, there was a complete changing of the guard in China at the Ulan Center. So I was unemployed for 9 months, and I was kind of doing different projects and writing in the US because I moved to the US in 2001. And then I became the director of ICI, Independent Curators International, and it was from there that I went to Russia. So it was from that position. And it's the same old thing. It's how these jobs work. It's like I was working with Hans Ulrich. He's somebody who I've known, there's 3 years age difference between us. So I've kind of grown up working with him in different ways in England. And I was there's a project he does called Do It that was started in 1997 in the US, and ICI was the first organization to do that. So then 21 years later, we were redoing Do It, and Dasha was asking him for advice as to who could be interesting to bring in as, at the time they wanted it to be a kind of director position. And so I got approached in that way. So it's the same old network situation. It's like, I mean, I think it's interesting that there are so many positions that are never advertised in the art world, and so many assumptions that are made as a consequence of that. I think it's really healthy now that we're trying to create more transparency and open things up in this art world so other people have the opportunity to get access, because it can't keep happening the same way.
Well, that's very, very interesting for you to say. But at the same time, you belong to, yes, of course, a certain part of the art world. But what I find interesting, and maybe here we should see some of the images that I know you brought with you, which are riveting. You immediately gave the garage the second iteration. Maybe for our audience, we should just explain that the garage is the first, again, correct me, Kate, if I'm wrong here, but I believe it's the first contemporary art museum, private contemporary art museum, created after 1917, after the Bolshevik Revolution of October. It's not only the first private museum in Russia, but it's also one that has immediately grappled with the notion of establishing a major institution, an international institution, with the local, the vernacular imprint of being in Russia, being in Moscow. Dasha being very interested and insistent on the role of architecture, for instance. We're not going to go through the history of the first garage. If you want to take us there, that's great. But immediately looking at this, the new one here, which is in a different location. It's in a park, a glorious park, and it was the architect who was commissioned to, I would say, dress in a way, because as you have 2 buildings there. You have an old building which was a kind of cafeteria for the Comintern, for the members of the Politburo. So it was a sort of very, very established, very privileged institution where one ate well during the USSR. That building remains and was kind of dressed by Rem Koolhaas, who has designed the facade that you see here. I love that photograph, and you might want to tell us something about this photograph. So it's a very interesting building in itself. And then you come into this and you give it, a whole entire new life. And I think it's, at the time you were probably the only one to do what you did and to give archival material such a role. Not just a tangential role, but an absolutely principal, crucial, physically visible role within the museum itself. So I'm sorry, I said too much, but I'd love you to, if you can, to unpack some of the rich items you put in front of us right there and then.
So one way to go back to what you were saying with this kind of private public, the way that I've always described Garage is that it is a publicly minded, privately funded institution. And I'm very specific about that because what you need to understand in the context of somewhere like Moscow or Russia in general is that there are state-funded institutions wherein contemporary art departments started around 2002, 2003. And Garage is founded in 2008. So it's at the beginning of what is understood as kind of introducing contemporary art into a society. But you have to recognize that just because something is state funded doesn't necessarily mean that it is publicly minded. There is a very different perspective between the state and what we understand in terms of the history of contemporary museums as public institutions. And of course, in the United States, the history of public institutions is predominantly privately funded. So there's kind of interesting comparisons to be made. And basically what's happening is 100 years later, there's an evolution in China, in Russia, in places where there's a new generation of rich people that starts to think about culture as important within, a society. So the building that you're talking about is actually, it was built in 1968, started in 1967. It is one of 6 prefabs that were tested out. And it wasn't actually for the Politburo, it was for the general public. It was 6 cafes that were at the beginning of leisure because it's the first opening up of Moscow in the Soviet Union with Khrushchev. So what he wants to do is create this concept of leisure. So he puts these, he tests out these prefab buildings in all the major parks across Russia. And it's the only one that actually remained, and it was partly a ruin. And then it's that building that, as you said, Rem kind of thinks how to create this skin, this contemporary skin, this skin of technology around it. So the whole thing inside is this concrete, which was, it's a prefab building. So it's interesting that then suddenly it's being revered. It's like early Soviet modernist structures. So in terms of, I need to try and that. In terms of what was happening at Garage, when it opened in 2008, and when it first started, it was understood as the kind of strapline for it, if you like, was a platform for new thinking. And it was basically literally a platform whereby projects, particularly international projects, could arrive and be amplified and then disappear again. So my job was to actually create a place, which is why I used this Garage as a place for people, art and ideas to create history. It was Garage Centre for Contemporary Culture, and shortly after I arrived, it became Garage Museum of Contemporary Art. The reason why it changed is because the word museum in Russia is more egalitarian than a centre for contemporary culture, which is in Russian elitist and somewhere that you wouldn't necessarily go along to, whereas everybody understands what museums are. So, but it is a museum without a collection, and the collection is like people, art and ideas creating history. It's like the kind of historical aspect is bringing these things together. So that's what I was trying to kind of think through, if you like. How do you create a contemporary museum in a place whereby it's very difficult to tell the histories because they're all underground that would be contemporary art? And so it used to just be exhibitions, and the education program started a couple of years later in a very basic way, because there is no real history of kind of education programs, contemporary education programs in museums. And so what I did was to kind of diversify the ways in which we would be able to connect art and artists to people. So thinking through commissioning, research, projects in different places outside of the museum, introducing performance, publishing. So just different ways that people can access artists' ideas. And also trying to provide different opportunities for artists. So you can see here, this kind of emanating painting that's in what's this kind of open doorway. This double height space is giant, and it is, when you think about the kind of monumentality of Soviet sculpture, the official Soviet sculptures, what I was interested in is offering a space to artists that provided a way of thinking through what contemporary monumentality could be, but inviting artists who don't actually deal with that because of the fact that they're from a very different generation and a very different structure. So Eric Bulatov is one of the underground artists, for example, an older generation in his 80s, but he was with one of the earliest artists to kind of go against the system. So trying to find different opportunities that can happen in a museum, trying to introduce different ways that you can engage with art in a place whereby the traditional exhibition space is still basically what you will experience. So participation in relation to art. Thinking about how to provide contemplation and participation at the same time, how to introduce big name international artists with some logic or reason. Louise Bourgeois, for example, did not start to become recognized until she was in her 70s. This often happens to artists in Russia, how to find kind of affinities rather than just keep plonking Western art into the middle of a place that has like as many kind of access to artists as we do on the internet. Trying to find a local context for contemporary art. You can't keep learning about what contemporary art is from Western perspectives, especially when you have a very rich history. So trying to understand how to create a family tree of Russian contemporary art. Trying to understand who begat who, because there is no written history of contemporary art because it was underground. So working with a lot of people, sociologists, artists, art historians, to make what ended up being a bush rather than a family tree. Shall I stop there for a bit? Do you want to, or shall I?
No, thank you. No, this is beautiful. What you're helping us to do is to understand what you did. I have a question for you, which is related. I mean, directly to the impact of your presence, your work there, which is that my wife is Russian, so we used to go several times a year to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, but and in fact I curated a show at the Pushkin in 2017. But any time I was there, there were tons of people. It was such a phenomenally vibrant, clearly successful, very young type of audience. Now, I'd like to offset this with my perspective as a professor in the West, in New York City, where when I do have students from the ex-USSR, it is notable that they have very little background in terms of modernist art history, because it's not something that you're taught, and you pointed this out yourself. This used to be, most of the modernist movement in Russia used to be underground, and it's just not taught. So how do you explain this? Suddenly you come in with these very impressive programs, and you get this tremendous resounding success, especially for the younger population. What was it that just made it immediately so attractive and vibrant?
Is it because in 2013 there were just over 200,000 people that were coming to Garage, and by 2017 there were just under 1 million people a year coming. So there was
there we are.
And it was a place that people liked hanging out in. It's like, because there wasn't the kind of academic or dry or like, it was a cool place to be.
Right.
And
yes.
It's in the middle of a park where in the summer, I mean, the summers are the best kept secret of Moscow. It's beautiful. There's people roller skating. There's like ping pong being played all over the park. It's like people are making out as soon as the first sun comes. It's like there's these big cushions that everybody gets naked on. And so, it was, I think pretty much everything we were trying to do was increase access, but also kind of demystify it. It's like, you didn't have to know what the history of art was. It's like, it was our job to shift that. It's not always about this foreignness to it. It's not coming from the West. It's integral to the way in which your life is. It's about, understanding the world through artists' eyes and seeing some weird and crazy stuff as a consequence. So, I mean, I can give other examples, but, I think that's kind of basics.
So we'll soon move into to what happened when you shifted back into the West. But could you? I was so struck during the your inaugural exhibition, which, as I began to say before, gave archival material such a central, like it was almost like the spinal cord of the entire museum. And you decided, it seems to me, if I recall correctly, to put almost next to back to each other, back to back, the vision. You looked at the Cold War period and put back next to each other archival material that were kind of mirror images of each country, the USSR seen via the lens of the USA and vice versa. And this extraordinary contrast that you created was sometimes shockingly surprising. And you saw, I mean, that's what I retained from it. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. You saw far more similarities or similitudes between those two countries that were enemies, but they were more like frenemies, it seems, or there was some kind of almost brotherhood between the two. And I was very, very interested in that. Can you take us back to this moment, which launched the new garage?
Yeah, I'll share my screen again and show a couple of images.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of two angles that we came from. One of them is building an archive collection. So it was a museum that had an archive and not an art collection. And that archive starts with the 1990s. And it's basically the accumulation of evidence of the fact that there was an underground movement, looking back from the 1950s up to the new Russia. And that is gathered by artists, and it's from artists most of the time, or from people who were around the movement going through the different decades. So that was one of the starting points, because again, you need to, if there aren't the collections, if there aren't, the artworks, it's like, how do you actually prove that artists were practicing? How do you put art and artists at the center of something? It's like, you need the, so that's the archive. And then, building histories as you're building the archive. Like, so some of the exhibitions you're talking about and the ways in which we were working is like, you don't just get an archive from a whole load of people, in this informal way overnight. So we were doing exhibitions, we were charting the history of performance from pre-Soviet to post-Soviet, like looking at 100 years of performance, because this is happening all over the world. Klaus Biesenbach is doing a lot of like history of performance as is performer. And so we're like, well, Russia's been doing it too. Let's like look at the equivalent histories and what the story is from there and start to conjoin them. Let's put like some of these rich histories out there for the world to be able to look at for the first time whilst building the archive. And then the flip side was garage field research. So this was a program that I started whereby artists would come to us and say, I want to research into XYZ. So sometimes it was foreign artists and sometimes it was Russian artists that would want to do research. And it's into like overlooked or little known events or philosophies. So this is Mariam Ghani, for example, who spent a lot of time looking into the Soviet film archives for film footage that was produced around Afghanistan. Because there were a number of Soviet filmmakers that were actually kind of charged to work with Afghani filmmakers to produce. We did the same thing with Koyo Kuo, looking into the relationships between African filmmakers in the 60s to the 80s that were all studying in Moscow, and how that impacted the African film world now. And what you were talking about is actually Goran Djordjevic, who was the person that wanted to look at the American National Exhibition in Moscow, which is in 1959. So that whole research came about trying to find people who were basically the invigilators or the visitor engagement people during that event in the 50s, and doing a lot of research, because there's a whole load of information that's been given out from the American side as to what that was all about, and very little that's coming from the Russian side because it was basically kind of covered over. So all of these projects came from what artists really wanted to look into, and that's a different way of mining and understanding philosophies and theories from a place, but asking it again through the lens of artists and their perspectives.
I usually don't do this, but I'm going to do it here. I see the number on the while you and I are speaking, while you're beautifully explaining to us your practice over there. I see people saying how fascinating they find your explanation. So thank you so much. I see Michelle Elligot, Chief Librarian, Chief Archivist of MoMA, telling us how rich and incredibly important the archives of the Garage Museum are. So thank you guys for listening. And thank you, Kate, for taking us through this, I mean, really unique situation. I just have a personal question, if you don't mind. I mean, I don't know whether you speak Russian, but I mean, even if you do, you don't, I probably came to Russia probably out of the group. How did you manage to immerse yourself so rapidly, so quickly, so effectively, and to impact the cultural map of that country, like almost overnight? It's mind-boggling to me. Do you mind my asking what your magic recipe was, where your wand was?
Yeah, because it wasn't me. It's a collective way of working. And basically what happens is I bring in like structures and systems and kind of think through how to create non-hierarchical ways of getting out there in the world and just looking at what's around. So you have to, I mean, my job was to listen really hard, to understand the culture, to bring many, many different perspectives together and to get people talking between each other and trying to work out how from within people start to decide what systems they want to produce. So it was always, my kind of thinking is that I would be successful in my job if I didn't exist in the end, or if I'm not known, because it's like there's no point in putting Kate Fowle did this for, because that doesn't mean anything in Moscow. Who cares? You know, it's about creating systems and structures and ways of thinking that put artists at the center and communities, and like basically give people the impetus to want them to grow in the way that they want it to be growing.
Yeah.
So that's my formula.
Yeah. I see lots of thumbs up yet again. You're really this is great. So would it be fair to say that your principal interlocutors, the people you brought into the discussion or to the table to begin with, were artists themselves, or how did this community that you're describing, how did it generate itself? I mean, you were the orchestrator after all of this process.
Yes, artists. But you know what's interesting is that there isn't a very strong artist community in Moscow. There's a ton of artists, but the tradition of kind of these generations of artists like teaching together or working together or sharing studios or having studio assistants because of the way that the education system is still, unfortunately, the formal education system doesn't even go up to contemporary art, as you mentioned earlier. It's like there were plenty of informal schools. And so there's some of it there, but really there isn't this kind of connectivity between generations. And so you have a lot of conversations. It's trying to bring people together to talk to each other, but oftentimes that doesn't work. But there are other people like sociologists or historians, a lot of journalists. And journalists are really the art historians in Moscow, because you know, to have a job in an art history department, many people left their jobs and became journalists in the 1990s. And kind of some went back into universities, others didn't, because you needed to be writing and talking about what was happening on the streets. And you know, your job in an art history department of like a major university that's to do with the official system isn't going to get you there. And so it's kind of finding different interlocutors that exist within you know, cities and connecting them together and getting people to talk. But there's also the post-Soviet generation. It's like the average age of people working at Garage is basically, I mean, now it will be what, 27, 28. So there's a whole load of people who are, you know, they weren't, their memories aren't of the Soviet Union. They're
Right.
coming of age in contemporary Russia, and this is their Russia. It's like they are anti-government, they are pro this. It's like there also isn't the same class system. There's the apparatchik system. Some parents were high up in various Soviet structures, but the majority of this generation that are currently coming into running these types of new institutions don't have any of that baggage. And so a lot of it is about them building. It's like it's they can build something for the future for their grandparents and for their kids and their kids' kids. And it can look the way that they want it to look. They have kind of freedom.
That is definitely something that struck me over and over. And you mentioned something which we might share with our audience, because it's really, that I don't think that would exist in the West, and that is that the glorious photograph that really struck me of the Rem Koolhaas facade of the garage now was taken, you told me, by a 22-year-old photographer. I mean, it looks, first of all, so professional, and it is indeed very professional. But which museum director in the West would give to a 22-year-old that task today? And it's very refreshing.
One that is 10 years older. It's like Anton Belov, who's the director of Garage, was 28. He's the same age as Dasha. So when he first started doing it, it's like, and he didn't come from the art world, because there isn't a history. It's like he's a super bright person that comes out of engineering and understands he has a very good business sense. And if there isn't a publishing house to be able to publish catalogs, then let's set one up. If there isn't a program for like Russian Sign Language, it's like if there aren't words that exist in Russian Sign Language to be able to describe art, let's work with people to make them. It's like he's that kind of person. So that's the 22-year-old the job of doing it. It's like it's about empowerment of your own generation. Yeah,
I think you just put it in a very neat way, and I think that's to me this is really something we from the West. I mean, it's true in this country. It's true in Western Europe. I feel we do need to think back about how to give empowerment to the younger generation. I mean, how many people do we know in their 20s who are in top ranking positions? And you are a little bit of an exception. Maybe you are no longer in your 20s. You look as though you could be, but this is very rare today. And we forget that in MoMA, for instance, the Bar was, I believe, 29 years old when he became the founding director of that museum. Today, this would be almost unthinkable, even though Glenn was very young when in 1995 he became the director. But that's a beautiful phenomenon that I think we need to draw upon. One last question, perhaps, about Russia. I mean, this is the largest country in the world. You are at the center. You're in the capital, Moscow. Was this immense? Sorry.
The largest land mass. It's not the biggest population.
Right. The largest mass. Thank you for the correction. And also the result of an empire of different civilizations. Everybody tends to speak Russian in the old ex-USSR republics now, but they're all very distinct. Did that huge mass of culture, different identities, impact your work at all, or would you say that your work tended to be more Moscow-centric to begin with?
No, I mean, one of the things that we began was the Russian Triennial of Contemporary, or the Triennial of Contemporary Russian Art, because there's as many Russias as there are places. It takes 11 hours on a plane to get from one side of the country to the other. It's like 2/3 of Russia is in Asia. And, it's an incredible country. It's like, but there are so many, I mean, this is, I would say, the only similarity between China and Russia. It's like there's the technological revolution and the industrial revolution happening simultaneously in places whereby you can get the internet as well in the more kind of remote areas in Russia. And if you're an artist practicing there, it's a completely different experience to those that are in Moscow and St. Petersburg or Ekaterinburg or Vladivostok, which are really the kind of four main places where there are art schools that you can go to. And so I did some traveling, but not that much, but with the curators who were all young and Russian, they did a lot of traveling because I thought it was very, very important that they go, you have to speak Russian to Russian and understand cultural differences, it's like, but you can't keep plopping foreigners in to like discover artists in like these more kind of remote areas. It's like, it was very important for curators at Garage to start to understand what their country was. So rather than looking internationally, it's just like, there's a huge wealth of super interesting work that is responsive to the societies that are like emerging now, and like it's the curator's job in Russia to find out about that, and then it's our job living in other places around the world to pay attention, because there's a whole load of assumptions as to what Russian art is or art from other places that need to be overcome, because it's just not, we need to stop assuming and start looking.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Just for everybody's attention, I just saw that Nick Bennett posted as a follow-up to Kate's remark here. We will find the link to the second triennial, which you organized, right? I mean, you co-organized.
No, the second one has just come down. So the first, I kind of started this whole thing. I've never curated either of them in the 6 years, because it's all about getting like practitioners in Russia to do the research on, but yeah, it's instituted and it's just had its second one.
Well, I'm sure our audience is also deeply fascinated to hear about what you're doing in this country now. And does it feel, so how did that passage come again about, can you tell us a little? I mean, obviously you were very familiar since you mentioned your time, your work at the ICI. I think you became a curator at the ICI the same time as Klaus began at PS1. Were you telling me that you were more or less of the same generation, right, at that particular moment? And
yes, so I became the director of ICI in 2009. And that's when Klaus became the director of PS1.
Yeah.
So, and then became MoMA PS1 in terms of name in 2010.
Right. And so you guys knew each other obviously well, and you sort of kept that link and that parallel communication perhaps with Klaus as things moved on. And then how did you hear about this new, I mean, you knew obviously that Klaus was leaving, he left and was not immediately replaced, but how did you come about in this new scenario with that? What was the passage? What was the transition?
It's always this secret stuff again, because now many organizations will use headhunters to find kind of key senior positions, but MoMA doesn't. So MoMA asks between its staff and its kind of colleagues to find out. So you can't, I couldn't apply for the job at PS1. There was no application process. There was no job description that was ever put out there in the world. It was sent to people. And so I received an email saying, would you be interested in going through the process of seeing if you'd be the right director for MoMA PS1? So you get an email like that and you're like, oh. So what's interesting is that going back to the Klaus kind of starting at PS1 at the same time as ICI, the common denominator between those two institutions is Agnes Gund. Because Aggie has been the chairman of the board of PS1 for the last 10 years, but she's been involved with PS1 since the beginning in the 70s. And she also was, ICI was started in 1975, but Aggie got involved because she knew the two founders. Aggie got involved in 1976, so the same year that PS1 became PS1. You know, and Agnes is somebody who I think, you know, there's 6 degrees of separation between a lot of things, but she's still one of these great connectors. So she put Klaus and I around the same table a number of times for dinners with different people because she knew that we needed to connect in that way.
Wow, this is fascinating. Yes, the great Aggie. Yeah, that's and somebody whom I should say is also a great supporter of Hunter College, as is Carol Goldberg, who put us in touch together. And so I'm thankful to her. I'm sure she's. They're both listening. I'm quite certain. Yeah, that's fascinating. And thank you for taking us through this. It sounds a little bit like a rite of passage, almost like a ritual. You know, when I was at Yale, there was these secret societies, and you were never, you could never ask to be part of a society. You had to be tapped on the shoulder. It was kind of a situation like this. So you're now back in the not back in the USSR, but back in the USA, and back in a very critical time. Yet I know, and you told me that you have an extraordinary program that is, I believe, going to really redefine yet again the very rich tradition of two directors, Alana and Klaus, that is behind you. Do you want to take us a little bit through your new vision? What is the new PS1 going to be under Kate Fowle? Can you tell us a few of your secrets, perhaps?
What's interesting about PS1 in terms of my trajectory is that it's the first time I've had the opportunity to think with staff around an institution that has a long track record. Mm-hmm. So because I'm kind of the startup kid, it's like ICI was an organization that kind of needed rethinking when I started there. With PS1, I mean, pandemics aside, you know, it has a really rich history and people have a certain perception of it. And what I did when I first started there was I spoke to every staff member and asked them what they thought the core values of PS1 are. And I also asked them for advice. What advice would they give me as a new director? What is it I need to look out for? What is it I need to be thinking about immediately? Before the pandemic started, we'd already had 2 board retreats, and there's an extremely supportive and engaged board at PS1. And so we'd already had 2 retreats and started, and again, the board went through the same process. It's like I was asking them, what do you think the core values of PS1 are? You know, what do you think, you know, we need to be thinking about in terms of looking to the future? So again, it was the whole way that I've been thinking about PS1 is to learn from people who are already invested in it and already care about it. You know, and what I found is that there were many people, you know, out there on the streets, you know, in Moscow, in China, people know about PS1. There's a fantasy of what PS1 is. There were many programs, like Warm Up is hugely influential for Garage, for example, in the way that we started our programs of music. YAP, the Young Architect program, was hugely influential in a number of places around the world for the way in which it spurred thinking about how to work with younger architects to create imaginary futures for architecture. So there's a way in which PS1 is a perception. And then there's a reality of what PS1 is at the time when I start there, which isn't necessarily what the perception is fully. And so part of the process of thinking through what the future of PS1 is to basically understand its DNA. You know, Alana, this hugely quirky, inspiring person. I mean, she literally she opened the space up for artists. I mean, she didn't open it up, it was already open. There were holes everywhere. It's but she literally kind of held space, if you like, for artists to make their own decisions. And, you know, the first exhibition rooms was literally just handing the rooms over to different artists, 77 of them.
Right. That's
you know, so looking backwards, it's similar to what I did with ICI, looking backwards, understanding where, you know, kind of mining the rich history that PS1 has, and then understanding where we're at now with this generation. Like, what does PS1 have to be now to continue the kind of ethos or DNA that matters for right now and forward thinking. So
it's fascinating to hear you say that. And in fact, I saw some other postings on the chat box, which thumbs up to your leadership at that ICI, which left notable marks and importance. But what I find really interesting in what you're saying, well, you were referring back to ICI. It seems also that what you were doing way back when in London continues again to be a similar thread. And I never thought about how how much analogy there seems to be between your practice, even though you're different generations, different personalities, obviously different histories, but you and Alana have started off with very interestingly similar concerns. And what I might ask you is, I mean, I did not realize what you were saying earlier about the impact that PS1 has enjoyed in both Russia and China. So in a strange way, your global trajectory was the perfect stage, a perfect transition to get into PS1. But how do you explain that prestige, that aura you mentioned that PS1 has been enjoying in China and Russia? I mean, Alana is very famous, Klaus as well, but what did they do that was so captivating to those two countries, do you think, if it can be put in a few words?
They put artists first. Alana put artists at the heart of everything. And then artists do stuff that is really cool. Mm-hmm. And artists are inventive. Artists like change the way we understand the world. Artists like help us traverse like dictatorships, like tyranny, help us think through social and political structures, you know, give us another way of understanding how we might want to interact with the people around us and the world that we're living in. And I think that, you know, because PS1 has never had a huge marketing budget, or it's not like it was out there, it's word of mouth. And a lot of it was, it was really cool. Like Warm Up is a really cool thing, and it's been going for 20 years. You know, it's that kind of, you know, and it's because it was, PS1 has kind of taken risks and put itself out there in a way that spreads. I mean, because of the current relationship with MoMA, it's like we don't have our own independent website. We're kind of buried within the MoMA website. So most of our communicating with our direct audiences is through Instagram. I mean, what other museum of the kind of standing that PS1 has Instagram as its main communicating tool? I mean, it's crazy, but it also kind of works.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So can you take us, before we talk about your future, your views and your vision of PS1, can you tell us, first of all, about the dire hardships that you are facing up in, which I mean, none of us, you neither, I'm sure, had any idea what your job would be like 6 months after you began. How is PS1 operating or not? What is happening with COVID-19? What are you able to do despite the restrictions we are facing?
Yeah, so I mean, on March 13th, nobody had a clue. Friday the 13th is the most poignant Friday the 13th ever, when we shut down and meant to be opening 2 weeks later. We ended up going from a staff of 47, we had to, 63 people. We had to furlough 47 people, which meant that I was on a Zoom call with 47 times doing the same torture. People were furloughed for 3 months. There were 17 of us left trying to work out what to do, working very, very closely with a kind of what was called a core working group of the board to imagine what the next steps were. We ended up losing $4 million. So we were an $11 million organization, and now we're a $7 million organization. And that's not going to change that much in the coming years because we've had to right size everything and completely go back to what our core values are and understand what of this DNA is going to help us bridge like this incredibly difficult moment into a future.
Yeah.
In the end, I did have to lay off 18 staff, 9 part-time and 9 full-time. And those people, none of them lost their jobs because of the fact that they couldn't do their job. It's literally that we just could not keep going at the same size, which is horrendous. And then we're having to look at how to, I mean, currently we have 2 floors open. And until a week ago, we only had 1 floor open in the courtyard. But we have some of the most incredible artists showing at PS1 right now. And we've had over 15,000 people come since September 17th when we opened.
15,000?
Yeah, over 15,000. So,
amazing.
yeah, it's like there's a resilience. The team is unbelievable, and again, it's a young team. We talk a lot about everything. It's like it's a discussion between like team members in terms of deciding how we move forward, because once you've had that kind of trauma, it ricochets through the entire institution, and there isn't one person who is privileged pain more than another. And so we're upsetting each other sometimes, pissed off with each other sometimes, but the general kind of way forward has been to keep talking and trying to bring the board and the staff closer together, so that there can be an understanding in that way as well, because that's something I think many organizations are struggling with at the moment, these kind of invisible powers, and like both within staff but also between board and staff. So kind of there's as much work going on around what kind of institution we want to be as there is planning into the future. So the exhibition that is on is called Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration. That opens September 17th. And it's, thank goodness, going to be on until April, because we all know that there's likely to be another closure period, January and February. But like, again, this is an exhibition. It's the first exhibition that I've brought in kind of under my tenureship, and it's curated by a woman called Nicole Fleetwood, who is a genius. But before she's a genius, she is somebody who, and I think you've spoken to her, or the Brooklyn Rail has spoken to her, but she spent 10 years researching into the relationship between mass incarceration and the production of art in prisons, or in proximity to the carceral state. So she's interviewed over 60 artists to write this book, which came out by, published by Harvard University Press. And she contacted me actually before I was even working at PS1, because we have a kind of 10-year friendship. And she wanted to develop an exhibition in relation to the research she'd done for the book. And when I got the job at PS1, I was like, Nicole, let's do this. Because there was a history at PS1 of thinking through art in relation to the carceral state. Taryn Simon, for example, did the Innocence exhibition back in 2002. Right. At PS1, it was her first major show in the US, or anywhere. Like, it happened to be in the US.
Well, that's great. Thank you for reminding us. And Nick, again, thank you so much for posting everything as you were speaking, Kate. Yes, he is also referring to an interview with Nicole Fleetwood. Can't wait to see the show. Thank you for this Mark and this invitation. You don't happen to have images by any chance on your PowerPoint, do you?
No, I only have one. It's like, because what we have on at the moment is started a new commission series. I'm just jumping through.
Okay. But I want to say, sorry, go ahead.
We're tending not to show a lot of images for Marking Time, because it really is important to go and see the show. So this is the only image I have. This is Tamika Cole, is this incredible artist that is in the exhibition that we're actually now doing a residency. Well, we're doing a non-residency because she's staying in Birmingham, which is where she lives. But we're working back and forth with her and with the Birmingham Museum of Art, and basically finding ways to support her professional development. So there's a number of ways there's 44 artists in Marking Time, and there's a number of ways that we are working with those artists. Probably more creatively than we would have done before COVID, because working out how to work remotely is extremely useful when you're thinking about working with artists who are either incarcerated or, because of parole restrictions, you can't all be in one place. So, but at the same time, there's a new kind of rethinking of the courtyard. So Rashid Johnson has produced the first commission that is happening in the courtyard, and it's called Stage, and this will be around for at least a year, if not a bit longer. And it's basically a project that is an invitation during COVID, a dangerous invitation, or potentially dangerous invitation for people to step up to the mic and say whatever they wish to say. So everything that's being said, sometimes there are performances that are arranged there. Other times it's informal. Everything is archived that is spoken into the mic and is accumulating and replayed back throughout the courtyard. And then
Nice.
The second floor has just opened up with great joy with the artists in residence from the Studio Museum in Harlem. And this is the second year of this collaboration with the Studio Museum, which you kind of briefly mentioned at the beginning, of basically until their new museum is finished, the new building that's David Adjaye is making for them. Until that building is complete, we will continue to collaborate with the Studio Museum on their Artists in Residence program. What's interesting, we're presenting the work from that program. What's interesting, or not interesting, what was terrible for these artists is that they couldn't get access to their studios for the vast majority of the time that they had. And we at PS1 have been thinking more about how to bring artists back into the actual building and thinking through how we can support artists kind of get back up on their feet, and longer term, how do we bring artists back into the way in which PS1 thinks and acts? And so Nordleen and EJ and Elliot have all been working in PS1 in some of the rooms to develop the work for their show. So it's been fantastic to actually kind of have them in the building over the last few months as well. And I have to say that their exhibitions are really incredible. And it's like, I mean, just take Elliot, for example, who's predominantly focuses on performance and likes to kind of challenge the institution in the way that he makes performances. And then suddenly he can't do performance. He has to rethink the entirety of what his practice means and the kind of confrontation that he might be able to produce when not able to physically confront anything.
Right. Yeah.
So each one of them has gone through an incredible journey. They've got to know each other really, really well, maybe more than they would have done even sharing studios next door to each other. And yeah, the outcome, the exhibitions are just brilliant. So, and they're on until middle of March. So that's the first time we've had the second floor open. Very exciting, 2 whole floors and a courtyard.
I joined the chorus again. I see that a number of people who say, I can't wait to see the show. So I'm with them, absolutely, with everyone here. I just want to say something personal that really strikes me as I hear you unfold the many layers of your practice, wherever that was or that is. And that is it seems to me, one of your signature marks, this sense of collegiality that is apparent whether you deal with artists in China or Moscow, here, right now during COVID-19. I'm very struck by something I did not know, which you said, which I absolutely love, because I did something somewhat similar when I was a humble curator at MoMA, but which is that the first thing you decided to do at PS1 is to talk to every single member of your staff and have them tell you what they think is good or less good with the institution. I think that's brilliant. That's very courageous. That's very generous, and that's very Kate Fowle. That's very much who you are as a leader of an art institution. And I wonder whether you might want to say anything, or just, I'm also happy if you talk. Just, I mean, first of all, do you agree with my assessment or not?
What do you mean?
Well, in your collegiality being very much part of who you are and of your practice, perhaps both as a human being and as an institutional leader. I sense that very much.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we're not brain surgeons. We're not saving lives. It's like we exist in one in culture, and 2 in a very rarefied area of culture. But we're as good as the relationships that we build with each other.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. It's like, and it's actually free to be generous to each other. It doesn't cost a thing. It's probably easier than being confrontational with everybody.
Absolutely.
So that's where that comes from, and it's recognizing that, I mean, it doesn't matter. It takes so many different people to create an institution in the same way that it takes so many people to make work. It's like, even artists who work in a studio painting know that it's like they wouldn't be there without a whole army of people that have made those paints, that have influenced them as they've been walking down the street, or with the art that they've made in the past. It's like, so it's kind of thinking more in those terms as to how it's thinking through ways that artists think to create institutions and trying to kind of produce that experience from the staff outwards.
Right. I'm struck you speak the language of artists so clearly, so deeply. Have you ever been an artist yourself? Have you thought about it? Or
Yeah, and I trained as an artist, so I didn't go. I don't have a master's degree, and I trained as a painter rather than doing art history or anything like that. So all the stuff that I've learned has been on the job, and basically reading theory, reading art history, kind of gathering information and learning by talking to people and reading books as I've gone along. So yeah, that's maybe where it comes from.
Well, I know that I see the number of virtual applauses. You're receiving bunches of roses on the chat box, and so I can tell that your participation today, your contribution is really incredibly vibrant and well received. But maybe before we turn to the audience, because I know they have a ton to ask, a ton of questions, do you mind telling us a little bit? Can you tell us a little bit about what you're planning, sort of hopefully post-COVID and very soon post-COVID, as we are beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel, we hope?
It's post-Trump. I don't know about the post-COVID.
Yes, exactly. Well put. Yeah.
It's not even worth thinking in relation to pre or post-COVID anymore, because it's just this kind of ongoing. I mean, the ricochet effect of what has happened this year is just not going to stop. I mean, the levels of duress that so many people have had to work under. It's like, I mean, the thought of closing down again. It's like, I mean, we're lucky in museums. You know, it's just like, you know, people who are running small businesses. It's like artists, like restaurateurs. You know, it's extremely difficult. So in terms of, there's a whole load of things that we have in mind. Immediately there are like the Nikki de Fowle exhibition that we were supposed to be presenting last year.
Wow.
It's going to be happening coming up in the summer, as is the show with Greg Bordowitz. And Greater New York, which was supposed to be open now, will happen in the fall next year. But there's a whole load of other processes that we're going through, which is kind of thinking through how we work more closely with artists to generate the future thinking and programming at PS1. So at the beginning of 2020, you'll see various things shifting and changing over 21. Rethinking how the courtyard is used, thinking about how we become more porous to our communities. We know everybody thinks that PS1 is artist-centered. What the hell does that mean? What does it mean to actually commit to being artist-centered or centering on artists? What does it mean to actually connect to your community, like beyond lip service or virtue signaling? You know, what is our community? Where is it? So there's a lot of work that we're doing, bringing people together to kind of talk about that and being honest about the fact that there's been many times when we haven't done a very good job, but we can say things, but how are we going to be doing it now? So a lot of more durational projects that will take longer, slowing things down, things taking longer, and kind of rethinking the relationship between exhibitions, events, and other ways of working. Like, does it have to be that a museum is full of exhibitions everywhere? Like, can it be a place where artists can kind of gather in different ways? And what needs to be public, what needs to be behind closed doors? So lots of thinking through that type of thing.
Yeah. Wow. You happen to mention something I was a little familiar with, but I'm sure some of our audience do not necessarily know what it is. Some of them are very familiar and so on. So could you you mentioned the Greater New York, which is really sort of an institution within the institution. And I think it was it started around 2000, am I correct? Or I was invited by Alana and Klaus around 2005 to participate in one, but this is this Greater New York. Greater New York.
2000. It was the first collaboration between MoMA and PS1. Oh, like that's
it's every 5 years, correct? And this is, I mean, the history is really interesting. Do you want to tell us briefly what it consists of and what shape it might take in this iteration?
So up to now, this is the 20th, well, this year would have been the 20th anniversary, but obviously it's not going to happen. It's like, so it's an exhibition that happens every 5 years, whereby there are curators. This year it's Inez Kashenstein, who works in the Cisneros Institute at MoMA. It's Uber Katrib, who is the curator at PS1, and it's Moses Seraburi, who is an independent curator that is based in New York. So it's those 3 curators and myself, kind of, who are thinking through what the exhibition will be. But it's going to be, we're starting to work with artists before the exhibition and hope that things will continue after the exhibition, and Greater New York will basically disperse from being a every 5 years, some kind of version of what's hot and what's not, shifting that model to Greater New York being something that PS1 commits to year in, year out, every day. It's just like, how are we going to be in the future? How will we be committing to working with artists that live and work or have a relationship to the Greater New York area? So some of the thinking around this exhibition is responsive to the moment that we're in. Some is responsive to that. What does it mean to be responsible for or commit to artists? And then thinking about different ways of involving artists in the whole process of building the institution alongside the exhibition Greater New York.
Well, that's a radical move. Is it? Was it your idea, Kate, to turn around the whole structure of Greater New York and turn it into a kind of, as you said, day in, day out?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with an idea, and then I work with a lot of people to work out how the hell to do, because it's easy to say it.
Yeah.
We're still in the process of working out how we do it.
Wow, beautiful. Well, before perhaps we I don't know if Nick is ready to maybe turn the mic to the audience, but maybe, is there anything, Kate, you would like to leave the audience hearing from you about your new, at the same time new and highly challenging, but exciting, super exciting arrival at the helm of this great institution?
No, I can just say that I can see lots of people in the audience that I haven't seen for ages. So it's really good to see so many friendly faces. And I'm excited to hear Coco later as well.
Yes, me too. Yes. Great. Well, thank you, Kate. Can we, Nick, are you around? I don't see you.
Yes, yes. We have a lot of great questions. Firstly, I just want to thank you both. And I want to echo what Teresa and the audience shared with me in the chat. This has been such a humbling, such a humbling and warm personality, Kate. I hope the system can learn from her intelligence and behavior for the future. So thank you for sharing that, Teresa. And I think we all agree. So we're going to jump right into the Q&A. I am going to pass the mic over to Jeremy for our first question.
Hey, Kate. Thank you for walking through your whole history and everything you're doing. I have to say, it's really refreshing to hear you talk about how you're shaping the program in an iterative way. And I also, as somebody who's done a lot of shaping of things and stuff, I know there's always this balance between like people needing to feel like they're buttoned up and that they have like a press release out for what they plan on doing. And that usually means keeping things in the dark for a long time and then coming out with this release. And it's so nice to hear the iterative model, because frankly, it works better for organizations. It works better for people. And it also takes a good amount of confidence that in the person leading it to know that, hey, it will work out. So it's nice to hear that. So and along those lines, I wanted to know, like, do you plan on actually being kind of documenting that process as you are documenting the way PS1 is kind of evolving and growing, and being kind of open around that? And I was also kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about how you're working with the team around the visioning and the principles and the stuff that you're changing, and are there stuff that you're deciding to stop doing? in the process?
So yeah, I mean, the kind of press release tactic, what we have collectively decided between, again, staff and board at PS1 is that no point in setting up a press release, sending out saying, we are going to be doing this before you've even done it. It's like the proof is in the pudding. It's like we need to put our money and our energy and our bodies where our mouth is. It's like, so we need to be doing things over time and seeing what works and what doesn't. In terms of documenting it, kind of and not kind of. We have a blog. It's an old Tumblr called now it's called ps1homeschool.org. And during the beginning of the pandemic, we realized that we had no way of communicating. It's like this whole like going to online and digital. We didn't have anywhere to speak to people from apart from our Instagram account. So this blog, which is an old blog that PS1 used to have that we just kind of started using, that is accumulating a ton of the work that we've been doing over the last few months. So that's a good place to start to see. And it's not kind of documenting from a kind of self-conscious, like, look at what we're doing. It's more kind of look at what is happening with various artists or various ways of thinking in this time. So it's an interesting question about documenting, because it's like, I don't think, we don't need to shout from the treetops what PS1 is. We need to produce things within PS1 that kind of get embedded into histories. So it's kind of thinking that way about how to document. When it comes to the staff, and I mean, at the moment, I don't think we've stopped doing anything. We've changed ways of doing things. And we've changed kind of working groups. So now it's a lot more, there's kind of one team, we're thinking less in terms of departments, and there's a lot of cross-pollination between teams, so that it's possible to kind of look at what we do. We're going to be doing a lot less exhibitions because we're going to be doing more other types of programming, but we still did warm up. It's just that we did it differently. So it's kind of, it's understanding what the constellation of different programs need to be and how to connect them all together and who is connected. It's like, who are the different teams working on the different aspects of PS1, right? And how can we integrate people who are working in maintenance, in visitor engagement, in communications, in curatorial, and kind of shift things around a bit so that different people have voices within this type of programming.
Thank you, Kate. Jeremy, I don't know. Sorry, did you have anything else to add to that? Okay, cool. Thank you. So I am going to kind of break decorum a bit and ask a question myself. Kate, you mentioned yesterday in our pre-check, or I don't know what day it was, sorry, days of the week are just blending together, but you mentioned something that really struck me, that you said in looking to PS1's future, you were kind of going back to its roots, and its roots were Alana Heiss. And I was just curious if maybe you and Joachim wanted to talk just a little bit more about Alana, and maybe how Alana's original vision affected how you're, thinking for the future of PS1. And also just a shout out for Alana, because she organized a few events for us earlier in the summer with some amazing artists in Puerto Rico, and she's just an incredible force of nature. So yeah.
That's Alana. Yes. Kudos, Alana.
It's interesting. It's like, because Alana is, I mean, she's a force of nature. But the thing, I mean, when you read the interview that I think you posted again, that Joachim did with Alana a few years back now, it's like she kind of brings lots of people around her. It's like everything was working well with artists. There was also the figure of Linda Blomberg, who was very much to do with the beginning of PS1. She's the one that actually found the building. And so I've been talking to lots of different people who have, there's also, I mean, apart from people like Tom Finkelpearl and, some of the more well-known characters who have gone through the halls of PS1 in terms of working there, it turns out that there was actually when I arrived at PS1, there is no education department. There is no pedagogical practice, and it's a school. So that was interesting to me. In trying to kind of mine the histories of PS1, it turns out there were some incredible programs that were started by people that were basically working with a whole load of people coming from the Bronx, from like Corona, from Queens. It's like that basically decided that PS1 was going to be their place. And this was because a couple of people working at PS1 who were artists, like were already working with different constituencies and bringing them together. They lasted 2 or 3 months and then disappeared in terms of the types of programs. But it's so interesting seeing there are so many people who kind of build up that DNA. And one of the things that you can see it physically in the building is in the stairwells. You know, when you walk up some of the stairwells and there's the kind of residue of some works, like William Kentridge or Cecily Brown. It's like they're not a collection, they're kind of like permanent temporary installations, but it literally is a second skin that artists have left like in the building.
Is there a repository of the archives? I mean, there's such a rich history to what Helena started back in the 70s. Is that somewhere, or are you, knowing your interest in archives, Kate, are you interested in perhaps gathering and making more available of that history?
All been done. So there's actually a book that came out at the very end of last year, beginning of this year, that is the history of PS1. And that's a project that Klaus and Alana worked on very closely together with Peter Ely as well. And that's a series of interviews. So it's also using the archive. So Alana's archive and PS1's archive kind of at one stage just like became one. And that is all now with MoMA. So MoMA has the entire archive and are slowly working. I mean, Michelle and her team, it's a long process of working through how to kind of structure, and like it's an incredibly rich archive. So that is still being worked on. But that was used for the book along with a number of new interviews. And then what we're doing now is looking at some of the kind of alternative histories to that history at the moment and trying to kind of give it more texture, but not through another publication. Thinking through, we've just started working with Bloomberg Connects, which is this app that again is another way that we can start to communicate longer term about what's happening in the building, because you can download the Bloomberg Connects app and then we can put information about PS1 and some of its histories and recordings and videos on there. So again, in lieu of not having a website at the moment, that's another channel that we've been using.
This is great. I see that Sophia just posted a link to the book you just referred to, Kate. So thank you. Thanks, Sophia. It's great. And, well.
Yeah. Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Kate. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to our Rail comrade, Charlotte Kent.
Hi. Well, this has just been a wonderful conversation. I want to thank you both. It sounds like there's some great things happening at PS1, and I'm really excited to be able to go back and do all that. But at the same time, I can't help but ask, especially in the context of talking about some of the technology things you were going to be doing in terms of downloading information and whatnot. I mean, if we think of this as maybe, you know, as you said, not a pre and post COVID, but like maybe an age of virus where there's a little bit more nervousness around these things, I can't help but wonder if you're thinking about more native to the internet works and maybe having online exhibits, not that are necessarily like, we will walk you around a physical room, but the type of digital work that is meant to be seen on a screen and can be productively seen on a screen. I'm just wondering if there's any bit of that you're looking at for the future.
Kind of yes and no. It's like I'm not somebody who understands any of it well enough. It's like there's this project that I did in I think it was 1994, and it was a collaboration with Brighton Lighthouse Media. It was when I was living in Brighton on the south coast. And we worked with Ingrid Pollard, and it was the first collaboration with an artist working with the internet. And so we would scan her work and put it on the internet. And then it's like, and I still haven't really fully understood the ways in which it's possible. But there are team members at PS1 that are thinking through that and thinking about, as we develop a new website, how it can be made integral to the architecture or the armature of what that website actually is, so that it becomes an extension of the building, if you like, of PS1 physical, right? Because we have this opportunity to start from scratch, to build our own website. What could it actually look like that would enable artists to practice kind of through that? But I'm not that I'm a complete Luddite, so I'm not the right person that can answer the questions as to exactly how, because we're turning to people that do know how more to work this out. But a lot of it has to be speculative again, because in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, it's going to be different for artists and what they want to be doing. So it's about creating armatures again.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Charlotte. Next, I am going to pass the mic over to Tootsie.
Hello. Thank you, Joachim and Kate and everyone at Brooklyn Rail for this fantastic conversation. And as the New York Times wrote, if you are able to, you must see the Marking Time show. You must see it. It is very powerful. So my question is, Kate, since the show is starting provoking a very important conversation about reforming the prison system, have you had any engagement with politicians who may be inspired by this show?
Yes and no. So there are there's a ton of public programming and kind of behind the scenes and Instagram takeover type work that we're doing alongside the show, whilst also building relationships with organizations that focus more on advocacy, building relationships with the artists so we can work longer term with them, and thinking about how to create partnerships moving into the future. Because one of the things that we're really aware of is that whilst PS1 has got a kind of short but fairly intense history of working in proximity to the carceral state with artists, we are not the experts. And if we speak out and say things just because we want to go, rah, rah, look at us, we're championing something, then we could be making some grave errors on behalf of people whose lives are at risk. And so what we're trying to do is build the networks with places like Art for Justice, with Worth Rises, with like Justice Arts Coalition, with a number of different places, so that we can kind of learn how PS1 can be a platform for advocacy moving forward and amplify the voices of people that really understand stuff now. Does that make sense?
Yes. I know that Kamala Harris was on the board of SF MoMA when she was a district attorney in San Francisco. Have you thought about inviting any of the local district attorneys to come see the show?
Yes, and they've been coming. So we've been inviting people and they've been coming.
Oh, great.
And what's important about the show is that people go out. There's also been DAs from like Philadelphia, from Washington, from Florida. It's like,
great.
So what's interesting is kind of having an open conversation, because there are like different DAs respond in different ways, some more defensive than others. So, and actually James Hoff, one of the artists, has just been working with the DA in Philly, who's an extremely progressive person, and doing some incredible work over the last year, again, like kind of pushing it out rather than kind of internalizing it within the art world. So
that's great.
Such an important project, really. Thank you for, these are great questions. Thanks very much, Kate, for answering, for taking us through this.
Thank you, Kate. That was a great answer. So I'm going to now pass the mic over to Daniel. Daniel, you should be able to activate your mic. Let me give it a moment. Okay, actually, to save time, I will read Daniel's question on his behalf. So not to put you in the upcoming exhibitions hotspot, Kate, but Daniel's curious, how will PS1 be engaging with architecture and architectural practice in programming and exhibitions in the future, or if that's something on the radar coming up?
yes, It is, but it's thinking. There's been some incredible work that MoMA has done with YAP, using PS1's courtyard for the last 20 years. And that program has stopped, and that was me choosing to stop it because of the fact that after 20 years, recognizing that PS1 is now in the fastest growing residential neighborhood in the United States. The idea of putting an architectural project up for 3 months in the summer and then taking it down and working at the speed of finding the next architects through a competition to put the work up. It's like we need to slow things down and think more deeply about what architecture is and how a non-collecting institution like PS1 can actually think through architecture. There's some collaborations that have happened in the past between MoMA and PS1 thinking. There's a show called Currents that happened, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago with Barry Bergdahl that was kind of thinking through some of this. But now we're thinking about PS1 and what it means being located where it is. I'm just going to share an image very quickly to kind of show you what I'm talking about because it's important. Like, can you see MoMA PS1 is the red? It's like what we started doing was mapping what happens if you walk 20 minutes from PS1. What is it that you find? So it turns out that there's like the Newcomers High School, there's the United Nations Funding Credit Union, there is the Fortune Society, there is the Jacob Riis Settlement, Queensbridge is 10 minutes away. So in thinking about architecture in relation to PS1 moving forward, we're thinking about the entire building and how the building can, like, we have this extremely generous piece of open land, the courtyard, that currently has this concrete wall that to make it feel a bit like it's a prison rec yard. As you walk in, it's like, how can we become more porous to the community and what does that mean? And how can we actually put architecture into action? What does it mean to have like a publicly owned, we're a city owned building. How can we take that space and activate it into the future? How can we put architecture in action? How can we think about it in relation to sustainability, to community, to different forms of engagement in the future around the built environment in the fastest growing neighborhood in the United States, residential neighborhood, where some of the histories are being completely overlooked because it used to be an industrial area where lots of things that shouldn't belong, like Rikers, the first stop off from Rikers, or immigration centers, are completely overlooked because they're hidden in there. So how do we start to think through architecture and design to bring some of that to the forefront?
I love your response. You just, as you were speaking, Kate, there was Mark Blocks and posting something like, build a wall, not.
Yeah, between the team at PS1, it's just like, bring down the wall. When it's the PS1 wall.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
And thank you for that question, Daniel.
Yeah.
I am going to now hand the mic over to the Rail's own managing director, Sophia.
Hi, Kate. Hi, Joachim.
Hi, Sophia.
You know, you've really answered my questions in many ways through your very nuanced answers to previous ones. And so I just wanted to say from all of us here at the Rail, thank you so much for being so candid and so generous with your time and your thoughts. It is so refreshing to meet a leader of a cultural institution with the values that you have and are so willing to teach the next generation. And there's a lot of parallels between the Rail and PS1 in the way we think about centering artists and also with our very young team. And so thanks for this encouragement.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sophia, for that, for grounding us there. Amazing. Well, that is, I think, a good moment for us to transition to a tradition we have here at the Rail. We close all of our events with a poetry reading. And today I'm honored to welcome Coco Fitterman to the stage. A very quick bio before I hand her the mic. A writer Coco Fitterman is a writer whose poetry has appeared in The Rail, in Province Magazine, and Brand New Life, among others. Coco has performed at Haus der Kulturen der Welt, MoMA PS1, American Medium, Printed Matter, and other venues in Berlin and New York City. She is the author of Say It with Flowers. And Coco, I am passing the mic over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for that intro. Thank you to everyone at the Rail, to Catherine, Ansem, and thank you so much to Kate and Joachim. That was a really inspiring and wonderful talk that I'm really glad I got to hear it. So yeah, I mean, I'm honored to be closing this out. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending as well. Okay, I'm just gonna read a quick poem that is in 3 parts. It's called Instead, a sharp limit, a diamond future, the saddest word. Art makes me less crazy. It should be looked at more and discussed less. It's an honest joy to be shocked by beauty in 2020. I was shocked when your GF was caught stealing from Whole Foods, gliding gracefully, invisibly through the post-individual milieu. I was thinking of a line by Lori Niedecker. I've been free with less. The manager stopped her. She just went to a different store. Poetry, a canticle for opulence, laziness. I cannot take your ex-girlfriend's antisocial social club hoodie seriously. And every image on your phone trembles. Look at it, at the opening, all these burnouts, boring sex tales, details of a friend's team, vermouth sweating like death all summer long, in the margin, the awful margin. I wish I could afford products from Sephora. Sometimes when I drop a lip gloss in my bag, the sales lady turns a beautiful blind eye. I live inside it too. I am at the reading, thinking about governance, all the gay horror movies, that warm feeling of camaraderie, and how trees smell in America. The dog is smaller than the love in it. Sundance me in lace filigree, a postcard from Death Valley, California. Even my own words, I write only somewhat, hardly at all. Baby bottle gold, boys in Adidas. I'd like to perform something outside of the patriarchy. Each sexual decision is a chance to end the world. This is discussed in various sources, an expensive form. All new thinking is loss. All new exchanging is death. Teens smoking DMT in the Amargosa Desert. Call your girlfriend. It's time you had the talk. Boys at the pool, serving drinks in the nude. I forgot the things you said to me. A Ukrainian working class guy went to NYU. Reminds me of my uncle. Looked into dark waters of the East River. Pondered suicide, spring semester. There are moments when the body is numinous, like a creep lurking around campus, just staring. Art Forum magazine. I dream all night. There are things you can't buy online, but when you dream, you can find them in other people sometimes. I dream about a castle, 6 white horses. What was that poem about horses in the ocean? Something about AIDS. I hate AIDS. I miss my gay uncle. 3rd generation, Eastern European glam, St. Petersburg's version of the cock on a Friday. Young boys sweating and discussing local politics. Some girl's toddler wanders into my lap. I forgot what this party is called. I left my phone at the club. I forgot what the club is called. In a place where older poets cruise. I shook the hand and moved on. I don't care about anything. My body, like a cloud. Nobody knows how clouds really look, etc. I can't afford the new iPhone. I have to look at your pics on a smaller screen. Reading Lorca in the Hamptons at my married friend's beach house, basking in the softness of day that comes with wealth. What's that Ashbery line about truth? That it passes on whether you leave it in or out or in. There are things you can't get from a poem, even if it is very beautiful. I'm not so jaded. I truly feel moved sometimes. Thank you so much. That's it.
Thank you, Coco. Snaps and claps. Everyone is snapping and clapping. Thank you so much for that reading. And I want to thank Kate and Joachim for being here with us today. And I'd like to thank Helen Lee for her work leading up to this event. I also just want to share a kind note I received also in the chat. There's a lot of love and warmth in the chat. Jose Paz said, thank you. Sorry, apologies. Said, thank you, Kate Fowle. Sorry, I just lost it. Sorry, he said, thank you, Kate, for bringing positive energy to a place I call home for over 14 years. So thank you. I want to very quickly say as well that this October marks the Rails 20th anniversary, and we'll be celebrating all the way into 2021. So please, if you can, consider making a donation to the Rail to keep our programming free and independent. If you're able to, please, support your local poets. There's some links in there for Coco's work, and support your institutions. So if you can, show some love to PS1 as well. I want to thank you again. If you can, we do this every day at 1 p.m. So join us. On Monday, we'll be joined by artist Charles Ray with Rail Editor-at-Large Toby Camps, and we'll conclude with a poetry reading from Robert Fitterman. I will now be able, you can all activate your mics and say hello or goodbye or whatever is on your mind. And have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Kate.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Coco.
Thank you,
Coco.
Beautiful day.
Coco, beautiful.
Good luck. Happy
Thank you,
moment.
Kate.
Thank you so much, everyone.